Struggled to get anything through the Senate. But this week, the Senate, for the second time, blocked the government's plan to scrap the $10 billion Clean Energy Fund. Now, that means the government can now call a double dissolution election to break the deadlock, although the Foreign Minister played cool.
Just because you're given a trigger, it doesn't mean you have to pull it.
Labor and the Greens have told the government, bring it on, Janet. How tempting is a double dissolution election for Tony Abbott now?
I don't think it's very tempting at all. I don't think there's any need to do it. I don't think Tony Abbott wants to do it, and I think Julie Bishop is absolutely right that just because you have the trigger, it doesn't mean you pull it. You know, these things will play out over the coming months ahead. Just because the Greens say, oh, we have a lame duck Prime Minister who doesn't want to call a double dissolution, you don't call a double dissolution election lightly. There have only been 6 since Federation. Right, and Malcolm Fraser lost a double dissolution election, so you don't do it lightly, and I don't think Tony Abbott's about to do that.
But Graham Richardson, the former Labor Senator, Bruce, said if there was such an election, Labor would lose, despite the polls. Who's right, Graham Richardson or the polls?
I like his crystal ball, but I don't think I'd be that confident if I were Graham that Labor would not win an election if it was held this Saturday. I mean, the depth of feeling out there about broken promises and about the slugs that people are getting as a result of this budget is very, very deep and very strong. So if you're Tony Abbott, you're thinking, I'm sure, I'm going to need the next 2.5 years to really turn around a lot of this and make sure that at the next election they're not thinking about you know, the paid parental leave scheme, for example, which benefits very well-off people over people who are struggling. They're the sorts of you know, inconsistencies in their cell of their policy, which make it very hard for them to tell a compelling story at the moment. So they're not going to have a double dissolution election anytime soon, if at all.
Janet, why is the government travelling so badly at the moment?
I think it has a lot to do with the budget. I mean, if you think about on the boats issue, they've had a great success. They said they'd stop the boats. The boats have stopped. You know, there was a press conference this week where they said it's been 6 months since a boat has arrived in Australia. They're not leaving Indonesia either, by the way. So that's been an important policy success. The carbon tax will be abolished.
You're talking about a success. I'm just wondering why the government's
now I'm coming to the bad bit. And OK, that is the budget. Yeah. And Tony Abbott will meet with Clive Palmer on Thursday. We'll see how that goes. Clive Palmer is too unpredictable for any of us to say what will come out of that meeting.
Because they need his senators' votes to get anything through the next
And those senators too, by the way, are individually too unpredictable, I think, for any of us to second guess what's going to happen there. But, you know,
I think they're going to hang, those 4 senators has got, I think will hang tough with Clive Palmer, at least for the next year or two, don't you think, Bruce?
I suspect they will while they're finding their feet. I mean, I think they're heavily reliant on him if they've got any prospect of re-election or whatever. And basically, as we saw in the last week or so, you know, 1 or 2 of them know diddly squat about political processes, parliamentary processes, policy. It's going to be, as Janet
more
says,
reason to cling to Clive Palmer.
Exactly.
I would have thought.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting, and I think very hard for the government to get through a lot of its budget. But of course, if they don't get through some of these more draconian measures, in a way that helps them.
But I tell you what, the one thing they will get through, Janet, I should imagine with Clive Palmer, provided he doesn't go nuts again, is the carbon tax repeal. Now, I think if that goes through, Labor's actually more vulnerable, I think, in an election setting, in an election campaign setting, than the polls suggest. It doesn't yet have a credible policy on boats. It doesn't endorse turn back the boats. It doesn't have a credible policy on the budget. It doesn't endorse a single cut. And it doesn't have a credible policy on the carbon tax. It still votes to retain the carbon tax. How can you go to an election with that kind of platform?
Well, even if Bill Shorten decides to abolish Labor's commitment to a carbon tax, and there have been suggestions coming out of Labor that may happen, it's too late now. It really is too late. The time for Bill Shorten to establish his leadership credentials and take Labor down a sensible policy path was when he became leader. Now he's just being pressured into it. It's too late. I think the polls at the moment don't reflect how people would vote at an election on Saturday. I think they reflect the fact that people are fearful and confused about the budget for all the reasons that we've discussed. There's been a misinformation campaign going on. There's been a lot of uncertainty. That will settle down. The test is...
You'd hope, but there is a problem in their messaging department, I think. Their media work is not tidy. And Bruce, I was struck, for example, that Tony Abbott's report had been talking to some of his ministers about messaging, apparently. For example, one example given is the Attorney General calling East Jerusalem a disputed territory, not occupied, and that's been a big farce. Arab countries saying they might do a trade boycott. Was that a mistake, or is like an example of what I'm talking about, or was that just a beat-up?
Well, it was a story that they probably didn't need, and that's created tension within the coalition, by the way, because there's a lot of people in the National Party who are worried about what this may mean if it affects exports. And you can see Barnaby Joyce and others starting to talk in much more diplomatic language about, the policy not really changing. It's just a terminological change and so forth. Look, as far as I'm concerned, it is occupied territory, and we should call it for what it is. That's my personal view. But I do think...
I can't agree with you.
But I do think...
I think the government's absolutely right here, Janet. I mean, why would you prejudge, say it's occupied territory rather than say it's disputed territory? Why pick a side?
Andrew, I agree with that, but I
enough.
don't think this was an issue that the government needed to get involved in right now.
I think
there are far too many more important things, i.e. the budget, that the government needs to focus on. Everything else is a distraction, and the government needs to work on its messaging in relation to the budget.
Well, Iraq. The jihadists fighting in Syria and now Iraq are luring Muslim recruits from the West, including Australians, who, then get the training and a taste for killing. Now, the government this week showed it was worried.
We are redoubling our vigilance at our borders to try to ensure that jihadists do not gain access to our country or are monitored if they have the right of access to this country.
Janet, are we doing enough?
I think we're doing what we can do at the moment. But can I just ask a question at the outset? Why is it that we don't ask what are the Arab countries doing? This is essentially an Arab problem. If you look at Syria, right, the US did not intervene in Syria, and yet you saw a grassroots revolution against Assad in Syria. You saw the emergence of ISIS in Syria, now leaking over to Iraq. So to just blame it on the US and the coalition forces and to say, well, what can they now do? When is it time to say to the Arab countries, when are the presidents and the kings and all of the Arab leaders in the Arab world going to fess up and say, well, this is a long-standing, centuries-old, simmering discontent between Sunnis and Shia that dates back to 632 AD about the rightful heir to Muhammad. For goodness sake, I know it's not just about religion, it's now about geopolitical,
sure.
Power within the Middle East.
We get onto the 6th century. I mean, Iran has actually been in discussions with the United States about doing exactly that, which just shows you how bizarre the whole thing about the Middle East is. We've come the full circle.
No, it shows you how weak Barack Obama is that he would even contemplate this.
Well, I don't know that that's fair to say. I mean, Janet's making a point here. Well, they intervened there for years and years and years, and the only way that looks like they could sustain this regime that exists there now is by continued military occupation. Is that an answer to the problems of the Middle East? Is that an answer for the United States? I don't believe so. Yes, I think they've got to solve their own issues, as Janet says, and that if that means the Middle Eastern countries coming together and trying to sort it out, well, great. But I don't think that will happen, and it'll continue to simmer.
Janet Albrechtsen, Bruce Hawker, thank you so much.